Hello, this is Jeff Romanchuk again. I wanted to do a summary of a recent paper my wife and I did looking into whether or not acetaminophen use during pregnancy um, or early in the baby's development cause autism. And I want you to keep in mind that my summary of it here, I cut it down to about 2,000 words, but the article itself is about 5,000. And I have a link to that if you want to see the whole article for the rest of the story. But let me give you the highlights. Here we go. Acetaminophen use causing autism. Summary of the research and accompanying issues. Kathy and Jeff Romanchuk for Everyone's Autistic in August of 2022. For more than a decade, concern that either maternal use of acetaminophen during pregnancy or early use of this drug by the baby increased the risk that the child will be diagnosed with developmental disabilities later, specifically autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. The focus of this meta-analysis is the ASD-acetaminophen link. Despite more than a decade of research, the cause-effect nature of the link remains to be proven due to the survey dependence of the data, other study design issues, and many confounding variables among both the earliest studies and more recent experiments. Isolating acetaminophen's toxic impact on those with autism would be the next obvious step, but we are not there yet and farther still from proof that acetaminophen use causes ASD in general, or has caused it for anyone in particular. That acetaminophen, also called paracetamol, or known by the brand name Tylenol, use by the mother during pregnancy can increase the risk of the child being diagnosed with ASD later. This has been published in the research since at least 2008, and Schultz's research team in 2021 suspected that acetaminophen use in babies increases the ASD risk by interfering with the body's endocannabinoid system, ECS regulation. The ECS is what breaks down the acetaminophen to release its analgesic pain-relieving impact. In addition to being a pain reliever, acetaminophen is also a fever reducer. It is for this reason that it is most recommended to women during pregnancy. Boer's team in 2021 echoed this manifold use of the drug, but also cited epidemiological studies indicating that intrauterine acetaminophen exposure increases the baby's risk of later ADHD and ASD by up to 25%. Bauer and Kreibel in 2013 observed that in utero use and later circumcision pain are not the only two times the child may have been exposed to acetaminophen. They add use of the drug either before or after scheduled vaccines for babies and toddlers. In 2009, Good pointed out that Schultz had already made this observation a year earlier in regard to acetaminophen use with the mumps, measles, rubella vaccines administered for those in the 12 to 15 months of age range and their later development of ASD. Schultz, one of the few who has been involved in the autism acetaminophen link from the beginning, characterizes his team's 2021 paper, a mini review intended to summarize current knowledge on the topic. There seems to be a consensus recently that now is a good time to look at what we know and how we got to this point in the acetaminophen autism debate. Boer's team looked at 11 international studies done between 1991 and 2008 and found that only one of them implicated a causative link between early acetaminophen use and a diagnosis of autism later. Bauer and Kreibel's 2013 ecological analysis was one of the early studies to conclude plausibility of a relationship between prenatal and early life exposure to paracetamol and autism spectrum disorders. They couch the connection as an early weakening of the immune system in susceptible children. The only study that cannot be faulted for some design issues is that of G's research team. They used stored umbilical cord plasma from the Boston birth cohort, BBC, collected between October 1998 and June of 2018. Their aim was to check the plasma for acetaminophen metabolites and compare these to later physician-diagnosed instances of ADHD, ASD, both in the same participant. Other developmental delays were none of these factors. They were allowed access to the BBC plasma and got permission to check each child's medical records for a documented diagnosis. One reason Jai gave for their research method is that most acetaminophen studies up to then had relied on maternal self-reporting. An advantage of the medical records follow-up is that it avoided another problem in this linking of acetaminophen use with a later diagnosis of ASD or other disabilities, namely that the regression and diagnosis occur months or years after the acetaminophen use. This lag time and the issues it creates have dogged the autism etiology research for decades and autism acetaminophen linking research from its start. In 2009, Cox and McDowell challenged Schultz's team for not only the parents' inability to remember what pain reliever their children got around the time of their MMR vaccine, but also for its lack of clarity on how subjects were selected and the controls put in place. Boer's team also noted more broadly that most parental questionnaires used tend to have poor internal and external validity, since they are developed from what are intended to be screening instruments, not diagnostic aids. Even so, Boer et al. Reported statistically significant associations between intrauterine paracetamol exposure as recalled by the mothers and a later diagnosis of ADHD, but not ASD. Jai's team expressed a similar concern about the survey interview responses from the cord plasma participants over assuming parents would accurately report to the BBC staff about smoking or drinking alcohol during their pregnancies. Bitker and Bell suggested the possibility that even if the acetaminophen autism link holds up, those who later receive ASD diagnoses could be more susceptible to fevers as babies and therefore be more likely to receive acetaminophen. Schultz in 2021 supported this fever increased acetaminophen use notion in stating one of the traits of autism is strong inflammation states. Similarly, Boer in 2021 pointed out in their literature review that indication, that is why the acetaminophen was prescribed in the first place, was a confounding variable unmeasured and not controlled for, despite the dose-effect relationship being highlighted. Boer added that possible genetic transmission of ASD was not controlled for either. That is, the surveys did not ask about other autism among the siblings or extended family of the participants. Despite the many confounding variables, most of the researchers find a likely impact on autism, if not a clear cause of it, in the way acetaminophen breaks down in the body. Bitker and Bell in 2020 suggested that children with ASD metabolize Tylenol less efficiently than neurotypical children do. Seneff's team in 2012 were discussing aluminum, mercury, and other toxins being introduced into the body from vaccine use, but they highlight the same neural pathway blocking that does not let the acetaminophen break down in the body and working in the brain as the drug was designed to do. Bitker and Bell's 2020 study found that children with ASD have a greater susceptibility to Tylenol toxicity than do neurotypical children. Schultz in the first study, 2008, noted that for children under 10 years old, sulfation by the liver is the primary pathway to detoxify, then have the body void acetaminophen. When this sulfation process is impaired, acetaminophen oxidizes to the toxicity metabolite. Let me get this right. N-acetyl P-benzoquinamine before being detoxified. Senef et al. In 2012 suggests the aluminum used in vaccines is toxic to vulnerable children and that neuronal damage due to aluminum penetration into the nervous system may be a significant factor in autism. Despite acknowledging the neurotoxicity, Jai's team in 2019 point out the overall low toxic burden of acetaminophen on the liver, kidneys, and intestines, and this renders it, in their opinion, safe for short-term use. They acknowledge there is no research focusing on acetaminophen use in a specific trimester of pregnancy, but rather the impact across gestation. Bauer and Kreibel support this long-term impact, citing a correlation between increasingly negative consequences and the time the mother starts using Tylenol or increases her use of it. Bauer and Kreibel, this is 2013, observed that studies tend to show a correlation in perinatal Tylenol use and later diagnoses, but often neglect to say why the Tylenol was being taken in the first place. The researchers need to add this why, since the virus, fever, etc. may tell us more about why the disability came next than the use of acetaminophen would. And related to the circumcision, Bauer and Kreibel also fail to point out, if anything, Schultz's team are the only research team to acknowledge the definition of autism has expanded over the past 40 years, from the DSM-3 to the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, text revision version. Their take is that the DSM-5-TR combines into autism spectrum disorder the pervasive developmental delay, autistic disorder, and Asperger's syndrome that were distinctly numbered and explained disabilities in earlier editions of the DSM. So there is too much going on in autism research and autism awareness to emphatically state that perinatal or early infantile acetaminophen use is the sole cause of an autism diagnosis. It does appear that acetaminophen use early, especially in large doses and over an extended time, can contribute to a later diagnosis of ASD in babies who are susceptible to this disability due to pre-existing autoimmune, environmental, or genetic issues. Many research teams continue to examine the suspected link, and future studies should be more focused and definitive. In addition to the many study design issues and confounding aspects discussed in the research to date, other factors outside the researcher's control are happening in the world of autism. More head-to-head Tylenol versus ibuprofen experiments should clarify if either alternative is the right and safe aspirin substitute. But this research cannot be survey-based or survey-dependent, especially if the subject mothers need to remember years later what was taken and how much. The other influence on the findings that needs to be controlled for is the range of what is called ASD now and the epidemic, as Good characterizes it, in the autism prevalence rate. How much this growth is based on the spectrum of current traits versus the former Asperger's syndrome, pervasive developmental delay, and autistic disorder sets of diagnostic traits is not clear. Even less clear is how much this autism epidemic and the many causes of autism being researched owe to the greater public awareness of and acceptance of autism as a worldwide disability. All right, thank you. If you have any questions, type them in below. I will get back with you quickly.